the strangest conversation you've accidentally eavesdropped on? Story 1A. Few kids were debating on what happened to the after you flushed it on the train. One believed it exploded on impact with the rails. Another debated the possibility of it being shot out of the side like a cannon. And another knew it was used to fuel the train. Story 2. I was in line for a roller coaster years ago when I overheard a 12-year-old and her even younger sister talking to two nice strangers, all standing in line behind me. The 12-year-old was talking about how she lives on a farm with her grandparents, her little sister, and her newborn kid. She goes on and on about her young kid, and how her grandparents homeschool her, so she has time to raise and take care of her kid, and how her little sister is helping too. She goes on to describe how little and precious and sweet her kid is, and how much she loves her. I spent the entire time in line stunned and speechless and impressed by how engaged and unbothered the two strangers were during the whole conversation, i.e., asking to see pictures, etc. It wasn't until we got to the front of the line that I realized she meant kid, as in a baby goat. Story 3 was checking into a luxury hotel when I was younger, and the people in the next room were like animals. So I keyed a bit slower than I normally would have because I had never been in this situation and I was intrigued. And then in between grunts and moans, she yells, "I bet your wife doesn't you like this?" Probably goes on every day, but I never heard something like that before or since. Story 4. At a Chinese restaurant. An old man says to his friend, "I'm telling you my swelled up like this." Then he holds his hands apart like he's holding a grapefruit. Story 5. I was once in a Starbucks in Boston and witnessed a breakup which was immediately followed a failed proposal attempt. It was the craziest thing. The dude was very into her, and her body language did not reply in a copacetic manner. He confessed his love to her. She replied that it wasn't going to work, and she might need some time. He replied, "We have the rest of our lives to figure out, so you have time to..." He got down on a knee, pulled out a ring. She stood up and said, "This is what I am talking about." "You don't listen," she asked him to stand up. He said with tears in his eyes, "Why? I'm still waiting for an answer." She gathered her things, took left out the back. The man sat back down and finished his frappuccino while crying. I refer to the story as the saddest cold coffee beverage ever. Story 6, not something I heard, but what someone eavesdropped on me. I used to work at a restaurant, and every member of the kitchen staff was Indian and didn't speak English very well. There was one white guy that worked there, and for whatever reason, they all called him Ding Ding. White guy was having a birthday party and invited us all. One of the Indian guys and myself were standing outside the restaurant smoking, and the Indian guy says to me, Indian accent, "Hey man, you got a ding ding party." A guy walking by us stopped and said, "I'm sorry, I just overheard you guys, and I have to know what a ding ding party is." I couldn't stop laughing and eventually told him what it was. Story 7, I overheard two guys on the subway in NYC discussing what was the perfect handgun caliber to someone. There was a small dude who was adamant that the best gun was a 9mm because that's what cops use. Then the big dude starts shaking his head negatively, goes on to give a small speech about anatomy ballistics, then proceeds to state that a competent assassin would use a mere .22 handgun, since it's hard to track, ammo is cheap, and you can magnum someone in the head without anyone knowing it's gunfire. I think those guys were on their way to the Hitman convention. Story 8, my neighbor's talking to a prostitute about paying the price of 1 hour, but she wanted double the pay because there were two guys with her. She wanted 1 hour per person, and the guys wanted to pay 1 hour period. Story 9, I once sat on my balcony 3rd floor at 2 a.m. to listen to a guy ground level who discovered his girlfriend was cheating on him 4th floor. He climbed a tree and saw her topless with a guy with her light on. I opened a beer and took a seat. "You said you were studying. You don't study with your shirt off." Story 10, once listened to a story a woman was telling her friend sitting next to me in a CF. She became suspicious of her husband cheating on her when she was helping him unpack from a business trip and noticed a weird white stain on his shirt. She told the whole story of her Googling how to figure out what it was, which I think included using specific light and stuff. Never actually got to hear the ending though, unfortunately. Story 11, me and some coworkers were eating lunch outside on a patio, and all of a sudden two guys walk by, and one goes, "I was licking her butthole," and forget I was allergic to peanuts, Sue. I spent the night in a hospital. We started cracking up, and the guy noticed and said, "What? It happens." Story 12, my downstairs neighbors were having a fight. I was listening to a woman yelling, "Did you her? Did you her?" over and over. It really got exciting when another woman answered, "No, I didn't edit Holy." This blew up after that initial argument. I started listening in. Mostly it was just swearing and denials. I did pick up bits and pieces about something in another chick's house. Drinking and a pair of shorts. There was some loud crying. Eventually I heard a door slam and some running in the outside stairwell. Nothing after that. They were still together next time I saw them. They moved out about a year later. Story 13, killing time in Starbucks before my bus comes when two well-dressed businessmen walk in. "Hey, Crazy day yesterday. Huh. Yeah, I didn't know you could train dogs to do that. It haunts me. I have so many questions that will never be answered. Story 14, Black family in the Christmas decorations, aisle 3-year-old dad. Can we get a white man for Christmas? Shocked dad, what 3-year-old a white man? Points at shell-shocked dad looks where son is pointing and laughs no son. That's called a snowman. Story 15, didn't hear the full conversation, but I walked in on 2 employees at a convenience store with a conversation ending with the phrase, and that's when we hid the clams. Story 16, I was eating beside 2 older gentlemen at a bar, and I hear one of them say something like, "That stupid cat follows me everywhere." I've told my granddaughter to keep it away from me, but everyone thinks it's funny. I can't get away from it. There's silence between the two, and then the second older man laughs. You secretly love that little hairball, don't you? The guy lets out a giant, irritated sigh and sullenly admits, yes. Edit wow. Thanks everyone for the upvotes and medals of honor. If I ever see those 2 softies again, I'll be sure to tell them how many people like this confession. Story 17, well, sort of the opposite, but when I was in high school, we would run laps around the perimeter drive of our football field for PE, and part of this drive was right up next to a bunch of classrooms. A lot of times, teachers would have the windows open. My high school is an old Frankenstein of addition from the last 120 years. So we still have windows that open and close. So my friends and I made it a point to have the absolute weirdest conversations we could right next to any of these open windows in an effort to distract and confuse anyone who happened to be listening from inside. I think my favorite starter anecdote was, and I shamelessly stole this from Whose Line, and that's how my colon ended up in my esophagus. I was later told by one of the teachers who recognized me that their whole class stopped and confusedly looked at each other before laughing it off. It was one of my proudest moments. Story 18, I was pulling up to an intersection with a bus stop right as the light turned green. I crept by this stop, and all I heard was an old black dude say, and that's how the motherfucker took my leg. I look out my passenger window to see him with a prosthetic in his hand, sitting in a wheelchair, facing the other people at the bus stop. What story they heard, but it was damn good. Story 19, I was on the train, listening to a woman yell on the phone that she wouldn't be able to make it to her dentist appointment because she had left her teeth at home. Story 20, just last week, I was in line for customer service at the grocery store with my girlfriend. Sketchy-looking dude comes up to the woman in line behind us, says hi, and she says something to the effect of, "I don't think I should be talking to you right now. I don't even know where my daughter is." They started talking quieter, and we couldn't make out all of what they were saying, but we at one point heard her say something along the lines of, "Why can't you just admit that she might be in Iowa?" Unfortunately, our turn to get help came up, and we had to abandon the conversation, which we would have been able to hear more. Story 21, in the 90s, when people used to use cordless phones, you could pick up phone calls on a scanner. This is how I found out our downstairs neighbor was cooking and selling large quantities of meth out of his apartment. Story 22, 2 college-age dudes walking by me. And that's why I'm going to know. You're going to, because of all that that's true. I do a lot of. Story 23, gangsta type sitting behind me on the bus, on his phone, rationalizing murdering his ex-girlfriend and anybody who got in the way to a friend who was trying to talk him out of it. The gangsta was telling his friend that this was something that Jesus would do. The next few days, I kept an eye on local news, and thankfully no reports of anybody being murdered. Story 24, 2 French strippers talking about one of them having period blood running down her leg while on stage. It was a dress shop, and I was sitting in a husband chair while my wife tried on dresses. They were sharing a room and would come out to the 3-way mirror and speak in French while they pose modeled their dresses. When my wife finally came out and it was time to leave, I looked at them both and said au revoir. Story 25, I've told this before, but whatever, 2 of my students were talking about this guy texting one of the girls, saying they think he's texting her to get to her friend who recently got her phone taken away. I chalk it up to middle school drama. Day goes on. Later, I hear the girl who had her phone taken away say, "I think I'm scarred." And something didn't sit right with me about it. I circled back and was like, "Hey kid, need to talk to me about anything?" She mulled out over for a bit and asked for a private convo. Turns out this guy had sent a third girl a pic, and oh yeah, he's not a guy their age. It's their teacher for an out-of-school extracurricular. That was not a fun day. Story 26, 2 of them conversation. 1 coming home on Amtrak from visiting my family a few years ago. A young 20-something couple sits behind me, and they clearly have just gotten engaged. They're happy. They're talking to each other in just the most loving, affectionate way and discussing plans for their upcoming wedding. It's all good. This is clearly a happy and excited couple. And you could tell this was probably the first discussion they'd had about their wedding plans. So the girl happily brings up something about what they should have on the menu, like 2 or 3 choices for the adults, but then a 4th option that the kids would like. And the guy goes, "Kids, I don't want kids there." Instantly, the temperature in the train car drops about 10 degrees. She goes, "You don't. How can we not let kids there? we have family members with kids. Kids have to be allowed. Then he says, and this is a point I thought was very valid, he says having kids at the wedding or having a child-free wedding makes it a very different kind of ceremony. It's not just a matter of kids are allowed, kids aren't allowed. It changes the tone of the whole thing, which actually I agree with. I'm not married, but I've been to plenty of weddings that were kid-free and some that were kids allowed. And they were both very different. The train ride was 3-5 hours, and the conversation just got worse and worse the whole way. Again, to give the prospective groom credit, he stayed very calm and tried to be rational about it. She went from glowingly happy to less happy, to attempted neutrality to furious. By the time we got to our destination, she was crying and yelling at him. He made points that if we don't have kids at our wedding, it doesn't mean we don't like kids or don't love our family members who have kids. It just means that if we want a more adult, intimate wedding, it's something we need to strongly consider. I wondered about them later on if that was something that was clearly a deal breaker for both of them. Conversation 2, this one is shorter again. A few years ago, I was at a small neighborhood drugstore. I was at the register paying for my stuff, and behind me was a girl with 2 guys, and they're buying 2 huge boxes of condoms. I'm facing the cashier when all of a sudden I hear the girl say, "We're gonna have a good time. You both are gonna get so lucky tonight. I'm gonna give you guys everything you want." I looked across and locked eyes with the cashier. We both communicated a silent holy to each other as she handed me my items, and I hurried out. I was eavesdropping on some popular girls in middle school, and the question came up between who they thought they would hook up with in my group of friends. They said my name. Biggest confidence boost I've had to this day. Story 27, I work at Walmart, so I tend to hear a lot of things IRL I shouldn't. One time I was stocking, and I overheard a couple who looked they were straight from the backwoods bickering with each other. He's pleading that he's sorry and that he didn't mean to. Then he says, "Baby, I'm sorry. I didn't know she was my cousin. It just slipped in. I didn't know these things happen enough to have an open conversation about it at Walmart." Story 28, I wish I heard the rest of it. But walking out of business somewhere, I walk past 2 guys talking, and I hear one say, "I don't give if they kill everything in the ocean. I don't eat seafood anyway." I laughed really hard before it clicked just how staggeringly ignorant that is. Story 29, I had a student job as an interim music director in a Catholic church. While upstairs in the choir loft getting things ready for a rehearsal later that day, I overheard the pastor talking to his parochial vicar, assistant priest, in the area below. The pastor said, "People are complaining that your masses are too long. You need to move it along." The assistant said something like, "I don't know how to say mass any quicker than I do," in a louder voice. The pastor said, "Don't overthink it. Get them in, get their money, and get them out." And with that, he left the church, with the assistant just standing there by himself. Story 30, last night, I was at a AAA farm team game in my city, and 2 men were sitting right behind me. They were friends from college. One was married and sounded more honest and mature. The other one wasn't married and described his apartment as being empty of anything but his mattress on the floor of his bedroom. The second guy kept calling girls either hot or ugly, and his friend asked him to tone it down a bit. They were saying this truly just 12 inches behind my ears, and they were talking loud to be heard over the commercials playing on the screen before the game. The second one asked the mature one if he thought he could hit one of the pitches, and he replied not without some training. The second one claimed he could hit one of those any day of the week. Eventually I moved because the second one wanted advice on getting laid, and I just couldn't take it anymore. Story 31, edit. So my brother asked me to take this down. Apparently it is still an active case, and he afraid it could land him in hot water. Note to those that had already read it, my bother did correct one detail in that they found 2 bodies, not just one. Edit 2 deleted edit 3. He said edit 2 was still too much info. Story 32, back in grade school. My mom would pick me up from school, then would go back to her office, and I'd wait there until her last class for the day ends. One time, one of her co-teachers just barged in her office and talked about how tired she was because she had gotten married the weekend before, and she and her new husband had been having a lot of since. They ended up talking about it as if I wasn't in the room. Story 33, I was walking out of the post office, and I stopped near the exit because I wanted to pack my stuff into my backpack. I stood by the wall, and there was a door next to me. As I was packing, I heard a man saying that someone in his family hung themselves on a tree. The body was hanging for weeks, and after time, the corpse got separated from the head and fell down. It looked like someone was sitting under the tree, resting in the shadow. The head was still hanging above the rest of the body. That's the only part of the conversation I've heard because I left the building. That was pretty messed up to hear, especially in a public place like that. Story 34, on public transit. I heard a girl on her cell phone loudly having a conversation with her friend. She had just left her boyfriend's family Christmas holiday celebration, where she seemingly clashed with one or more of his family in one respect or another about things to do with her relationship with the guy. She had apparently spoken to him about it, and he suggested they speak to the offending parties and sort out the problem confrontation. And she tells her friend, I told him I was embarrassed to have a conversation with strangers about her personal life like that, airing dirty laundry in such a public setting. I mean, how crass can you be? She says loudly, on a bus with no less than 30 strangers who can hear this conversation about her personal life dirty laundry, because she can't control the volume of her voice. The irony was lost on her. I ever gave her the raised eyebrow, and she had no idea. Story 35, I was sitting in the food court of a mall, eating and minding my own business. A couple passed by my table, and all I heard was her say to him, because my head went numb when you were laying on it last night, I will never ever get any context for what I heard. Story 36, I was really young, and a group of around 20-year-olds were sitting behind us in a hockey game. One chick said, and I quote, my phone just vibrated so hard on my brow, I almost myself. Not the weirdest, but still makes me laugh to this day. I was at a dumpling restaurant, and the two young women a few tables from me were talking about Craigslist hookups, BDSM, enjoyed being slaves, stuff like that. How could I not listen in? My favorite was when the one was talking about a guy she saw every week for that domination stuff, but it's not like I want to date him or anything. Story 37, it wasn't a weird conversation, but an exceptional coincidence. I was halfway around the world in Greece, eavesdropping on 3 girls gossiping about one of my old coworkers over dinner. What are the chances? Story 38, this happened the other day, and only just remembered, was cycling home and overtook some young lads, at a glance I'd say about 13 to 14 years old, mouthing off to each other. But as I was cycling past, I genuinely overheard, oi, mate, you know I'm going to get when I'm older and have my own garden, a fucking fuchsia. I just couldn't. Edit, ooh. Thank you, stranger, for my first silver. Story 39, on the bus outside Sunday school with 2 preteen boys, and then he ate their brains for his dinner, dude. That's not what happened, it is. He rose from the dead, and then he ate them. Yeah. He came back from the dead, but that doesn't mean he was a zombie. Then why did they call it the Last Supper? Story 40, in high school. I was in the school cafeteria line and overheard a couple of students talking about war. One guy was confidently explaining how he was sure that Sweden was going to invade Finland soon, and that he was planning going back there to defend it with his dad and uncle. Dad was from Land Island, and at their family estate, they would set up the first line of defense. This was in Sweden in 2007. The invasion never happened. Story 41, I was at a rave, and we went outside to the smoking area, past a group of people, and one guy was really excitedly saying, you're going to die, I'm going to die, and everyone we know is going to die. Really wish I'd stopped to hear where that was going. Story 42, in the library, and a girl on the phone says, baby, just come over, I want to make love to you. And make spaghetti. I know I can't change the past, but I can change your future. Story 43, I was sitting in a Chinese restaurant with my friend next to some construction workers, and I said something along the lines of, has Enrique received the shipment? And my friend played along and said yes, but if he finds out we cut it with baby laxatives, we're over. We continued the conversation for a few minutes, and I could see the construction workers getting a little weirded out. They got their bill and walked out, and on their way out, I heard one loudly exclaim to the other them boys were talking about lacing something with baby laxatives. Story 44, I was in the cafeteria at work, and 2 women were discussing their children. One of them declared that it was obvious that her son was gay because he was showing all the signs. The boy was 10, not 10 years old, not even 10 months old. This dumb saw all the signs of her son being gay while he only was 10 weeks old. I wanted to confront her, but you cannot change that level of stupid. Story 45, this was actually accidental. Not accidental, but I was at the train station about to go to this enclosed section where they had heaters. As I turned the corner, the first thing I heard was, and the dude wanted me to make him. It was this big Mexican guy with tattoos all over his neck and full sleeves talking to his girlfriend. And as soon as he saw me, he stopped. We both looked at each other and then burst into laughter. He explained that he worked at a rubber molding company and he had a guy call and asking if they could make a custom for him. Story 46, I was spending the night at my mom's house for Christmas. Her birthday is on the 25th, and we usually go to a movie for it, so it was just easier for me to spend the night, so we could go out the next day. Anyway, it's about 2 a.m., and I'm outside having a cigarette, when suddenly I hear one of the neighbors yelling, "What are you doing outside? Get your back in." Immediately after, I hear a kid yell in protest, followed by, "Dad, I just wanted to see Santa land on the roof." This kid snuck out of bed and out of the house at 2 in the morning, when it was probably like 20 outside, just so he could see Santa. It was really adorable, but also pretty hilarious. Story 47, I was on lunch, and I was sitting in a small room away from everyone else. I usually have my headphones on, but the wire tends to slip out of my phone from time to time. As the cord came out, I heard a co-worker crying and talking to someone on the phone. She recently discovered she was pregnant and wasn't sure who the father of her baby was. She guessed it was one of her coworkers that she had an on and off relationship with and was going to tell him that he was going to be a father when they were meeting up in a few days. That was about a year ago, and to my knowledge, he doesn't know that he may not be the father. Story 48, not strangest, but one that stuck with me was an old man and what I assumed was his wife sitting in front of me on a bus, casually talking about death. They had no fear. They were talking about funeral arrangements, what they hoped would happen to their family and so on, and they talked about it for hours. It was a Greyhound cross country, and sadly it was pre-cell phone, so I didn't even have something to stick in my ears to block it out much as I really wanted to. Story 49, I was eating at a small cafe, and I overheard the older women next to my table talking about how their young female neighbor got AIDS as a result of the time she spent with Nigerian painters. Story 50 was working behind a bar in Birmingham, England, walked back up to the other end of the bar where I was originally serving this one woman, and the convo went like this: woman Yemi and John had a great 20 years of marriage. I can't complain. Randomer at the bar, oh, that's lovely. You eventually had to part ways then. Woman, I had to divorce him in the end, yeah. I found out he was abusing children. As I walked up to their end of the bar, I stopped to check something on the till and accidentally made eye contact with the both of them. Absolutely horrifying. Story 51, behind two ladies in church. Lady 1 says quietly out of the side of her mouth, I have a very unladylike itch. Lady 2 whispers back, that's okay. I just farted. Story 52, while I was sitting at a bus stop, this guy walked up talking, looking really pale and kind of dirty, and sat nearby me. I actually had my headphones in my ears, but no music was playing yet, so I'm guessing the guy assumed I couldn't hear his conversation. He started describing the way a person's body looked as they laid on the ground. And when he touched their skin, it was ice cold, saying that blood was everywhere, and he didn't know what to do, so he left. So, as I noticed, he started looking to see if I was paying attention and talking lower. I tried to act like I was listening to music because I was petrified. I still, till this day, don't know if it was a joke, if he witnessed murder, or committed one himself, but that was definitely weird. Story 53, woman telling her friend about how she cut herself because the guy, let's call him, whom she loved, rejected her, went on to describe how her husband saw the cuts and understood because she was still in love with but it didn't want her calling him anymore because his wife didn't like it. Story 54, I also remember that me and my friends heard my teacher talking to another about her boyfriend. She was crying, and she was talking about how he is never home. And when he is, it's late. We gave her a big hug when we saw her. We were leaning against the door listening because they were in the classroom that we had our next class in. Story 55, at a Motel 6 in Eureka, California, was visiting Redwoods with my family as a kid. As we're trying to sleep, a couple in the next room over start fighting, and the guy says, don't break my achy, breaky heart. Best part was my mom said, just lay down low in case there's any gunshots. Thanks, Mom, SMH. Story 56, not a conversation per se, but I was randomly looking at my neighbor's laptop screen in class once, and she was frantically Googling things like what to do when you've lost your engagement ring. I felt pretty bad for her. Story 57, a couple sitting on a bench in a park, talking low-key to each other. He said something to which she giggled and said no. He repeated it, and she laughed a bit louder, saying no again. After he leaned in for the third time, she snapped and clearly said no, I will not pee on you. Story 58, first night in college, my roommate and I got a Perkins Diner-ish restaurant for a late-night meal, and to get to know each other, they sit us next to three girls in their early 20s. They decided to play What's Your Weirdest Experience? My friend and I bonded over our silence and immediate facial expression-based, don't say a word, and just listen agreement. One girl said she met a guy on a blind date. He had flowers, so she banged him on a tree limb. They started in the treehouse and wanted to be dangerous. I still don't care if it was staged or a lie or a sorority dare, but that roommate is still like family. It's been 20 years. Story 59, overheard on a college campus, presumably retelling the events at a party. All over the floor, didn't know what to do with it. I ate the... Story 60, when I was 16 or so, the landline rang with my dad's cell number. So I answered. I turned out to be a pocket dial. I listened in for several minutes to hear my dad screaming obscenities at someone who hadn't paid him for a drug delivery. At this point, I knew he was an alcoholic and did drugs regularly. He'd often disappear for days, and none could get a hold of him. I just hadn't realized how involved in the other side of the process he was, and on top of that, he rarely cursed around my sisters and me. He went on to yell about how he needed that money to buy his kids Christmas presents, which broke my heart on a whole other level, because he was using us an exercise in guilt and lying the whole time. I knew that, come Christmas, any presents under the tree were likely the result of my mom begging him for money to find us a few small items, or for my brothers pitching in money from their jobs to get us gifts. Story 61, in high school, went to a sit-down, Quite famous New York restaurant, no longer they're notorious for both its excellent pizza and purportedly mafia clientele. I didn't really believe it, but the classmate I went with and I overheard two Sopranos extras in the next booth talking about actually whacking a guy. I think it was even more explicit than whacking, like, you killed that guy. Yeah. At which point my sort of date said to me, did he just say he killed someone? Record scratch. Total silence. Total terror. Moment passed. Story 62, probably going to get buried, but I've always wanted to share this. I was at the commissary, and basically this guy said his wife said she was going back home to the Philippines to visit her mother and needed staying longer than planned. Ghosted him completely, and he ended up finding a bunch of messages or emails or something between her and some other guy in the Philippines, and it pretty much looked like she disappeared on him to be with a new guy. And they were standing right in front of the cereal I wanted. Story 63, after school, I was walking to the gate. I eavesdropped on some group of kids, and a boy was yelling at a girl cause the girl kicked him, and the boy was yelling at the girl about how being kicked in the was 100x the pain than a girl giving birth. Story 64. There were times I didn't have a stable home when I was a kid. Once I overheard the person watching me talking about how they didn't want me around when I was like 7. I honestly don't remember caring at all, but I can't imagine my oldest, who just turned 7, having to deal with that. She's had a pampered life, so it's different, but having kids makes me view my childhood differently. Story 65, when I was a fireman, me and another fireman who was black heard our captain and engineer bragging that they were going to tell him that I hated black people and tell me that he hated white people. Next shift, when they told us we acted like best friends and confused the out of them. Can't imagine what would have happened if we hadn't heard. That was 25 years ago, and we're still best buds. Story 66, I was in the bathroom, minding my own business, when a guy comes in and sits in the stall next to mine. All of a sudden, I hear dialing noises. I was like, is this calling somebody? Yep, on speakerphone while taking it in a public bathroom with someone else in it. Girl, hey, is this important? I'm working and it's really busy. I can't really talk right now. Guy, hey, don't worry, this won't take long. I was just wondering, I got some tickets to a comedy club this Friday, and I thought you'd like to go with me. Girl, sighs heavily, no, I'm not really into comedy. Okay, I have to go. Hangs up. I really wanted to flush or say something, but that was so cringy. I felt bad. Story 67. So then I turn on the light, and she is a bigger than mine. What did you do? I just turned her around and kept going, but she kept trying to sew. I would slap her hand away. It was bad enough as it was. Didn't need her busting on my bed. At that point, I was staring them dead on with my mouth gaping in shock, and they noticed and changed seats. I have never enjoyed church that much. Story 68, at a Mexican family restaurant. A couple of country club baby boomer folk were gossiping and bitching about how they were pushing back against their town developing even an inch because the cost of living would rise amongst other factors. Keep in mind, the town next over was booming with many residential and businesses popping up, and this was about as interesting as a tumbleweed rolling by. I never would have thought that these city-elected older generation members is why many cities aren't growing, because they're hell-bent on their backward principles and selfish interests. Story 69, heard a couple who had just given their newborn up for adoption. I was working retail, and they came in for a shopping spree. They didn't seem like the most intelligent people, kept going on and on to each other about how much money they were gifted from the adopting parents. They had apparently just come from having dinner with the adopting couple and seemed more moved about getting free lobster than giving away a baby. For what I saw and heard, the baby is definitely better off. Story 70, I was at the pool at Caesar's Palace lounging when the people in front of me were talking about one of their tattoos. Bro, one, what's with the coordinates on your arm? Is it your hometown or something? Bro with tat, sort of. It's the coordinates to my hometown strip club that I lost my virginity in. Story 71, haha. Here I was thinking I didn't have a good one. I was on an Uber getting home late at night, and there was this man drunk in the back seat. He's complaining how to never hire family or friends when you're trying to start your own business. He started going on and on how those closest to him never showed up when he needed them to, and how they just want his money. Apparently this dude had hundreds of thousands in the bank. Then he gets really upset when he gets on a call with someone he knows and threatens to kill them and them up. This is the point where the Uber driver sends me a text message saying, sorry, this dude is really drunk. I replied to him saying, it's cool, if only he could buy us some food with those Benjamins, cause him hungry. We talked about food for the last 5 minutes of my ride home, haha.